Remember, God makes his covenant with Abraham, and Isaac is the next descendant that must take up the burden of the promise of the covenant. But he's not a dominant figure in the story, remember. Also said that he's not a very strong leader, because his mother sort of pampered him, it seems, and that rubbed off, and he wasn't a very strong leader. But the one thing that the writer does tell us is that he was a man of prayer, he was a man of meditation, and that rubbed off on Jacob. So that was the important characteristic that he carries over from Levi. Again, on the issue of the barrenness, same with Abram. The barrenness is also regarded as proof of the divine purpose of a child who was destined to fulfill a special role in the history of Israel. We also see that with Samuel and his mom Hannah. Same thing. Same thing with Elizabeth, who couldn't bring forth children. God blesses her. God will struggle with the children. We feel future rivalries between the two nations. And then you have Esau and you have Jacob. The one the favorite son of his father, which is Esau, and the other favorite son of his mom. And it seemed right at the start of his birth that he wants to take over the role of the firstborn. But we also talked about the firstborn and the father, because although the law said that the firstborn would naturally get the first right, the firstborn would actually sell his birthright. There was such a law in the I'm not sure if it's the Mari or the Nutsi text, but there is such a law. You will see it in the feast regulations that there was actually such a law that somebody could sell his birthright. Amazing. We also looked at Jacob and the fact that his character wasn't very strong, a deceptive man. And this would obviously also, same with Isaac, and then the meditative spirit that carries over Jacob. That deceptive spirit which was in Jacob carried over to his sons, because they actually see him eventually. It's in the Nutsu text that you have the practice of both the blessing and the birthright, because both could be upheld in a court of law. And in the case of a birthright, you could carry it over to another, either a brother or family member. But Jacob, his mother hears of the plot of Esau to kill him, so he flees and then he lands up with Laban. And on his way, obviously, to Laban, which is in Aram, or Padan Aram. And it's quite a hectic journey, because remember here at the bottom, in the south of Israel, he virtually travels to the north. He virtually travels from the south to the north of what we would eventually become Israel, just to go to his family, which is Laban in this case. On the way, he meets up with God, and God teaches him a lesson with regards to his presence, that he is everywhere, and that is not just the tribal God, God of the tents, but he's also God of the weary traveler. And so he finds God on his way, and God will remind him again the next time of his presence, the same way he gets to Esau and he has to meet up with him. There again, same thing, God reminds him, listen, I'm still with you. Stop worrying. In this first dream, that he realizes both his walk before God and also the weight of the covenant responsibility, because it's quite a weight. Then he meets up with Laban, who's quite a match for him, just as deceptive as what he is, it seems. He makes him a servant, and for 14 years he has to work with both wives, Rachel and Leah. And then another 6 years, by the way, just to get the book, that's 20 years of his that he worked for him. An exceptional time. For 2 Ephraim's 7 years old, and then for one, and then just to get over his flock, another 6 years. But during this time, obviously his wealth increases, and then Laban's son become rather jealous of him. So he's again forced to leave home and actually return back to where his father is. So he informs his wives. His wives agrees with him, because they're not happy with their father either, for the way they are treating him. Their social position is becoming an inferior one. Not only that, they're also worried about their inheritance. So what do? They steal the household gods. Another word for the household gods, or what we call the teraphim. It's called a teraphim. It could be an image. It could be an image of the people in the home as well. Alright? And that little God is an important thing because it relates to the inheritance and the fact that they will retain that inheritance based on the fact that they retain this little idol. Now, there is a law which says that should Jacob decide to marry outside of Laban's clan, and he doesn't take another of his daughters, then those daughters and he will lose their privileges to the land and whatever possessions. So they could lose it. So that's why they want to hold on to this little idol. Even worse, not only does he work for 14 years with no wages, there's no wages. He says 10 times you have changed my wages, but that's only in the last 6 years, so by the way. Because for the first 7 years the wage was the one wife, and the next year it was another wife. But he changed obviously because he switched to Rachel was here in the first 7 years. So while Laban is away, he decides to run again. He's always on the run, always on the run. And when he pursues them, obviously he's going after the little idol because he realizes the little idol is gone. And he realizes why the daughters obviously did this. Because it's about inheritance and he wants that back. But Rachel devises a plan, she puts it on a camel and she sits on it and she says, it's my monthly, so please leave me alone. And he leaves it alone. That's how they get away with it. Laban and Jacob settles their dispute with each other through a covenant. Okay, and then we said there was two monuments. One a sacred stone, another a heap of stones. One which is called Gilead, meaning a heap of witnesses, and then Mizpah, which means a place of watching. The rights of Laban's daughters were to be protected. The law of the land stated that if an adopted son took another wife, besides the daughter of his adopted father, he would forfeit the land and buildings which he had inherited. They agreed to respect it. They even set up a boundary. And they invoked the presence of God to watch over both parties of the covenant, so that if one party violates his part of the agreement, God will punish the offender. So the covenant was a baie serious ding, al was dit net tussen mense. But the real test lays ahead. Esau, he still needs to meet up with Esau whom he deceived. And here, while contemplating about the matter, two angels met with him to inflict spiritual pain because they had been relying on himself instead of God. And how often do we not do that? We move between faith and fear always. Always we move between faith and fear. The word when the psalmist speaks about God, there's two things that he always speaks about. He calls it his steadfast love and faithfulness. It's a refrain right through the Psalms. You will find those words: steadfast love and faithfulness. Yet as humans we move in and out. And God constantly reminds us constantly, depend on me, rely on me. I am faithful. And it's a constant. So he's reminded again of the presence of God, and he names the place Mahanaim, the presence of God's host or two armies. But he forgets it. As soon as he hears that Esau's on the way with his 400 guys, he forgets. And full of fear, he turns to prayer. He does 4 things in the prayer. In fact, he invokes the presence of God. There's the thanksgiving, there's petition, and reliance upon divine faithfulness in verses Genesis 32, 9 to 12. The passage, and Jacob said, O God of my father Abram, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your people, that I may do you good. Then in verse 10, he gives thanks when he says, I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. This is the only one that has covered this characteristic about him. That God is constant. He doesn't change. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Then the petition, please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. Then verse 12, the reliance upon divine faithfulness. But you said, I will surely do you good. So he reminds God, and I think that is important, that we remind God of his covenant that he made with us. We see it in the life of Moses constantly where he reminds God of the covenant, that it's his people, that it's his chosen people. I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered or multiplied. Okay. And just after the prayer, he goes into it again. He collects a sizable number of animals, divides his remaining possessions in the family, and then he sends them across the brook. So he's waiting for his brother with this huge gift. But the writer reminds us that Jacob's struggle was with God, and he needed to make things right before he faces Esau. So again, there's this meeting with God, and he wrestles with this angel or supernatural being. Hosea 12:3 verse 4 says it's an angel who was overcome by Jacob's tears and supplication. En aan die Afrikaans is daar so 'n mooi woord vir ootmoedig. Dis diep. Dis diep en ek dink ons doen te min daarvan. Ja. Die ouens het geleef voor die Here en dan hy kyk homself. Ja. He literally stripped himself of everything. That's what he stripped himself. The same thing when they do sack and ashes, what's it, sackcloth and ashes, it's a way of stripping themselves. Verse 32, verse 5 indicates that he wrestled with a supernatural being, while verse 30 of the same chapter confirms that it was God. Alright, now, the writer presented the encounter as a description of Yahweh's dealing directly and personally with Jacob to change his life and give him a new name. And God does that with us from time to time. Hy maak toe stilstaan. En ek is op so 'n stadium in my lewe met werk. The old Jacob was defeated as the hollow of his thigh was touched and he was left helpless. His self-reliant will was broken. Broken body, no strength left. His only hope was to put his trust in God's word of promise. A new name, he who strives with God. He's called Israel. Same like Abraham, and Abraham, now he too becomes the father of the nations. So three things happen there. Now this writer says it as follows. This experience was a spiritual turning point in the life of Jacob. From then on, he not only bore the name Israel in his struggles with God, but his self-seeking nature began to fade into the background. And similar words to which John the Baptist says, I must become less, and he must become more. I'm not even worthy to tie his shoelaces. And Jacob finally meets Esau, bows 7 times down to him. Die arme mannetjie. Hy wil altyd opmaak. And Esau responds by running to meet Jacob, embraces him and kisses him. He urges him to take the gift. Esau eventually, I think he's rather forced him to take the gift. Nothing is further recorded about them, only that they buried Isaac and the listing of his genealogy in chapter 36. Jacob then journeys to Succoth, then to Shechem, where he built an altar on new land that he purchased. And then we have a spiritual relapse of Jacob, and it was an odd thing when you read the story of Dinah, who was raped by Shechem, the heathen Levite prince. And then the dad comes along, Hamor, and says, listen here, let's make right with you. I'll pay you a dowry and my son will marry her. That's how they get to make right with rape. And the sons are obviously upset about it. And they devise a plan to get them back. And so they, in the agreement that they make with each other for the wife, for wife to become Shechem's wife, Dinah to become Shechem's wife, there is there's ons amper half 'n inlewing wat hulle doen. They need to become Jew or Israelites too, in a sense. So they're asking to circumcise all the men in the town. And then, on the worst, like she said, while they're at their worst, they go in and destroy them. Father is not very happy with Simon and Levi leading this slaughter. And what one doesn't notice sometimes in this passage, and actually, is that the fact that these two sons have the last word. So Jacob does not have the last word here. And that's why the writer reads it as a spiritual relapse, because his sons has the last word here. While he's saying to him, you didn't do right. Dis mos al maar daddy, maar mommy. Jacob then returns to Bethel, and he instructs his household to put away their foreign gods which were among them and prepare by purifying themselves. He had again fallen into distress and desired to return to the place where God had answered his needs. God again promises a blessing of a fruitful heritage and a promised land. After departing from Bethel to Ephrath, Rachel dies during childbirth. Going back to south now. She names her offspring Ben-Oni, and here too there's a change in what we call culture. The mother is normally the one who gives the name of the son. Here, Jacob, no longer Jacob, but Israel takes the lead as the father of the nation. And he says, no, I'll change this rule today. This is Genesis chapter 37, verse 1 till the end of chapter 50. The aim here is simply to see God's providential care and plan for his servant Joseph. You'll see that the same thing in the aim, it remains the same. We're looking at God's hand all the time and how he moves to bring to fulfillment his plan of salvation. Not only for this nation, but this nation must take the word or the gospel of salvation to the other nations. To see God's providential care and plan for his servant Joseph in the strange land of Egypt, and to learn the historical circumstances leading to the enslavement of God's people by the Egyptians. A very well-constructed story is a mooi story om te lees. Vir die eerste keer lyk dit soos 'n volle storie is met 'n klomp karakters tussenin. Abraham also not too many characters, they just survive the way along the way. Isaac also really not dominant figure, but the story of Joseph takes up quite a bit of the history here. Well-constructed narrative, beautiful plot. 'n Mooi storie om te sien het om te lees het hier is in. Dieselfde soos die boek van Rut, die boek van Esther. Dis stunning stories. Historical in character, but here's the problem. No particular pharaoh was named. And then Potiphar, which is then the same name is used for the priest of On, including Asenath, the daughter, which was given to Joseph as a wife. These names can't be found anywhere, so it's difficult to attach a time to them. Okay, that type of information archaeology has not discovered it. The land of Ramesses is equated with the land of Goshen, which is the eastern delta of the Nile. That is where the Bedouins from the southern peninsula, according to archaeology, are often allowed to come and bring their flocks there to pasture. The other problem here is Ramesses 19. The Ramesses 19 dynasty, which is dated too late for the story of Joseph. So there's a few contradictions and there's not enough evidence here to bring these stories together. Now there is historical evidence for the Hyksos, meaning Bedouin princes or princes of the land, which was a body of invaders of a mixed race who conquered the Delta region about 730. Then you also have what we call the Philistines, that already started, according to archaeology, and you can see it in the piece that I gave you, already started coming in around about 2000. Now you have two sets of Philistines coming from Crete. There was one who was more, what is the word? They were more into agriculture than the warlike Philistines that we know. So that first grouping is the ones that Abraham possibly made contact with, and they were given another name. And then later, because if you read about the Philistines, you're looking at around about 1200, and that doesn't sit well with Abraham again, and the dating of Abraham. But according to archaeology, they have proof that it happened in 2000 BC already. So then we can make that connection between them. The period following the expulsion of the Hyksos might correspond to the beginning of the reign of a new king, which knew not Joseph, Exodus 1:8. Joseph is often used as a type of Christ, but the writer, one of the writers, also in the same piece that I gave to you, kind of warns against that, unless it's specifically in the New Testament that is used as a type, then only he will agree to it. But that's his argument. They say Joseph was an idle son, brother, I'm not so sure of that, servant, administrator, maybe later in his life he was the idle son, brother, but not early on. While he was young, he was a bit, hy was 'n bietjie brekerig, en ek sal homself verslaan het as ek sy broer was. His character is displayed as exemplary and his faith in God unshakable. Once the dream comes, that faith is unshakable. He doesn't know how it's going to work out, but it's unshakable. The story stresses God's providential hand in the growth of a family into a nation. God's chosen people had a place in his redemptive plan, and the story shows how he preserved and provided for his people. Joseph is the favorite son of Jacob, son of his favorite wife Leah, through which the genealogy of Christ runs, not in the Bible. He's the second youngest son, but there's a bit of enmity between him and his brothers. First of all, he's bringing stories about him. There's his vain boasting of his two dreams that they would all bend before him. There's the favoritism for the coat of many colors by his father. His other brothers don't get spoiled like that. And then just a note on the dreams, and we'll also note that with the baker and the wine bearer, the cup bearer, and then we'll also notice it with Pharaoh, that repeated dreams. And repeated dreams in this case indicates fulfillment. Alright? His envious and embittered brothers seeks to kill him eventually, because they're not happy with this young, what's it, opgeschoten blom nie. Eventually his brothers often has to take the flock away and take them out to a pasture. So they're away for a while in Shechem, and Joseph is sent to go and inquire as to their well-being. So as they see him coming, they start plotting to kill him. But here already we see the character of Reuben and Judah, part of the character of Reuben and Judah, because they kind of mixed. They catch on a bit of nonsense too along the way. They suggest an alternate plan. And then he sold the 13 Midianite traders, which also could possibly be Ishmaelites, according to chapter 6, 26 to 28. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham by Keturah, as Genesis 25. And then you have the Ishmaelites, which is descendants of Hagar, Genesis 16. And here we can also see how that character of Jacob is carried over to his sons. deception. Dis so belangrik wat ons doen vir die kinders. Baie belangrik. Jacob deceived his father Isaac. He deceives Esau into selling his birthright. And here he is betrayed by his own sons, who leads him to believe that he has lost his favorite son. But we also note in the story that Judah and Joseph is central in the family history. Judah, leader of his people and also an ancestor of David. Joseph, on the other hand, a noble character through whom God preserves his people. And here's the contrast. There's the purity and righteousness on the one hand, and then there's Judah's immorality. And the writer does that again with Tamar, who is seen as the ideal wife, who would do anything to preserve a deceased husband's name. We will speak about that a little now. She tricks her father-in-law to give her a child, doing her duty as a loyal wife and maintain the family honor. As opposed to Potiphar's wife, misleading men. Now the story of Tamar, and here again a bit of culture in the day. Remember, if you were married to one brother and he passes on, then the next brother is given, and so on and so on. And the second brother is given, but he spreads his seed on the ground. God is angry with him. God takes his life. Then there's the last little brother, which is but he's too young. And so he's promised that when he's old enough, he'll become her husband. But Judah forgets about Tamar. Tamar ever does not forget. She is adamant that she must maintain the family of honor, that she must carry on the name of the family. And so she wants what is rightfully hers in terms of the law. And so she tricks him. In the passage itself, the writer never actually tells you that she did a bad thing. That doesn't mean that it was necessarily good. Right? Even though the text does not speak to that particular part of the story. She dresses up like a prostitute, he goes in with her, and then he doesn't have anything to pay her with. So he's going to send the little lamb or goat of the flock later on. In the meantime, she says to him, listen, leave something with me. So he leaves his seed, staff, something else. There's three things that he leaves with her. And then he finds out that she's pregnant, that she's got a child, that she's been adulterous. And he's the first one, according to the story, to call out that she needs to be burnt. That was just one of the ways that you could dispose of somebody who was adulterous. The other method was obviously stoning. And depending on the situation, one or the other could apply. But what stands out to me in this story is the following. She was prepared to lose her dignity to uphold the law. Just think about it. She was prepared to lose her dignity to uphold the law. Paul in Romans writes the following. He says, even if it costs me my life, so that you Jews will understand what you have in Christ, then I'm prepared to lose even that. In fact, I think what it seems to me is I'm prepared to go to hell for you. Dis hoe uitverkoop hy is aan die wet van God, aan God self. And I think for us, and this is how I would apply the text to myself, is how far would I go to uphold the law? Now, not in the Old Testament, are we? However, it says you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And then it says you will love your neighbor as yourself. That is the law. It has not dissipated when Christ came. He said, I did not come to abrogate the law, but to fulfill it. So then I may also ask the question, how far will you go to love your wife? Wives, how far will you go to honor your husbands? I think that's the main thing out of this beautiful story. It sounds sick when you read it, but the writer wants to bring something across here to us. How far will we go to uphold the Lord God? And look at that. Tamar's name is listed in the genealogy of the Messiah. Amazing. Whom God chooses to use. Absolutely amazing. Her actions would be justly condemned today, but within her own culture she acted within her rights. Far from home and a slave to Potiphar, we see the trials of Joseph. He remains obedient, he remains honest and completely reliable. 5 times we are told that it was the Lord that caused Joseph to succeed, and that his master reaps a harvest. God reminds us on 5 occasions that it is God who caused him to succeed. And not only that, look how the blessing plays itself out to the other nations. Who reaps the harvest? A foreign man. So part of the covenant is already in play here. You can clearly see the covenant in play, because the hand of the Lord is with Joseph. Another man reaps a harvest. The Lord was with Joseph. The overruling providence of God is evident in this passage of dreams. And the interpretation is very simple. The butler is restored, baker is to be hanged, and it happens just like that. 2 years later, same thing happens. Pharaoh has 2 dreams, and remember we said if it's a repeated dream, it's more than likely to be fulfilled. No magician or wise man in Egypt could interpret the dreams. Only then does the butler remember Joseph. Again, Joseph says the same thing. It is not me. God shall give an answer of peace. And then the interpretation follows. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The repetition again here simply means that it's predetermined by God. It will happen. And Joseph, a very practical young man, prepares for the famine. And his advice is very simple. 1/5 of the land's produce to be stored during the plenteous years. I worked for Vodacom for 13 years, and in the 6th year when we worked there, because you tend to remember stories like this. You remember stories like this teaches you about life and how to respond in different times and how to respond to different events. That is why you need to also stay in the Word. It teaches you about life. One must look ahead sometimes. Like he's looking ahead, he sees the dream, he understands the dream, now he says to himself, okay, this will happen. God has ordained it so how do I prepare for this now? Joseph is appointed as the chief administrator of the government's food conservation plan. In fact, he's almost like second in command. He's like, he would be the prime minister in the way we term it today. He receives a signatory, a golden necklace, and an Egyptian wife, the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Now the gifts, according to the writer, may indicate both religious and civil authority. Joseph forgets his troubles and his family. 2 sons are born to him, Ephraim and Manasseh. God actually guides the state of affairs in Egypt through his servant Joseph. God is the chief coordinating factor. That's the point he's trying to make. Look how the nations are blessed again here. Even though Joseph goes ahead to prepare for the family that must eventually arrive there, other nations also come to Egypt for food. You see how the covenant plays itself out again. Nations are blessed because of God's covenant with his people and to those who will uphold the birthright. During the famine, 10 of Joseph's brothers were sent to Egypt to buy food, and it seemed that over a period of time their attitude had changed. The author is careful to point out their lingering guilt concerning the mistreatment of Joseph and the deception of their father. In contrast, we see the righteousness and mercy of Joseph to this guilt. He's concerned about the well-being of his father and Benjamin. But he obviously devises a plan because he would like to see his family. So he accuses the 10 of being spies, sends them back with their money back in. But they're not aware that the money has been put in there. So they discover the payment for the grain in the bags on the return journey, and the guilt only increases. What is this that God has done to us? Jacob is left dismayed when he learns that Simeon has been retained in prison. So one of the brothers is kept back to ensure that they return. They stay for a while because he obviously does not want to lose his brother. So eventually the famine obviously takes a toll, the food is up, and they have to return. Jacob refuses to allow his only remaining son of Rachel to return to Egypt with Reuben, but the famine has the last say. He finally relents and also sends gift to the Egyptian official, which is Joseph, including the money found in the bags. Joseph is so overjoyed to see Benjamin and prepares a lavish banquet. He spoils his younger brother. The only problem is that they have to sit one side. These are shepherds. So again, their sincerity is tested because they sent home now for the second time. But before they do that, they approach the steward to tell him, listen here, we brought back the money because somehow it landed up in our bags again. So then sincerity is tested again. They sent with the grain plus the silver cup of the Prime Minister. Like net erger. But this time, Joseph sends his stewards after them. They stop them, find it in Benjamin's bags. Now we have a real problem because Daddy is going to lose it. Back in Egypt, they tried to defend themselves. And their sincerity is demonstrated when Judah, and here the strength of Judah comes through. Even though he declares to Tamar at the one stage for not upholding the law, he says to her, you are more righteous than I. Here we see a different Judah. When he offers to suffer on behalf of Benjamin, he's prepared to take his place. And here's the lessons from the narrative that the writer would like us to remember. One, the providence of God. That God may choose to use evil for good. We may be tested in the most adverse circumstances, but we are called to be faithful. It is the very nature of God. His steadfast love and His faithfulness is what Jacob banks on when he prays to him in chapter 32, 9 to 12. He reminds God of His steadfast love and His faithfulness, but we are called to reflect the very same thing. Remember that God convicts of sin, not you. You can tell somebody about what they are doing wrong, but God will ultimately convict them. God makes aware of the need for forgiveness. God uses our guilt to bring us to confession and repentance. And the beautiful thing is when He brings us to repentance, He not only forgives our sin, but He also deals with the guilt and shame that comes with it. This is concern. So we said Joseph eventually identifies himself and expresses his concern for his father's welfare. And he assures him, guys, don't fear. God has sent me ahead to preserve life. And so finally the story comes together. Finally he begins to understand the dreams that he had at the beginning. Finally they begin to see what he had spoken about. So dit vat 'n tyd soms om te sien God se plan en God se wil en hoe dit homself uitwerk. En dis hoekom is dit so belangrik. That's why faith is so important. It's what faith is, the one thing that pleases God. When He says, listen, just trust me. You won't be able to understand or see now, but give it some time. Be patient. He instructs them then, go back, go and get your father. Come to the land of Goshen. Remember, we also called it the land of Ramesses. When we opened up the talk, that's where they would pasture their flocks, so that they may be close to him. But the writer says that this also fits the Hyksos period of Egyptian history when they invaded Egypt and ruled from about 1710 to 1550 BC. In fact, the Cretans or the Philistines also invaded Egypt prior to that and stayed there for a while before they were also ejected and the Pharaohs took over again. The capital was in Lower Egypt, the delta region of the Nile. In Exodus 12:40, it indicates the Israelites were in Egypt 430 years. Now, if Joseph rose to power in Egypt at the coming of the Exodus, we may date the Exodus plus minus 1275 BC. There is two theories regarding the dating of the Exodus, the birth of Abraham and so forth. But in the next it's a teaching on Old Testament background, where they take that a bit further and they take a look at the evidence that is available. The book is a little bit outdated, which I've made notes on it just to get it back up to date again on my own side, because it seems that the new information has a stronger argument than the former one. So yeah, when we get there. Chapter 46, Jacob seeks approval at Beersheba for going down to Egypt and offer sacrifices. Always wanting to know the will of God, and it's important that we do that. And the funny thing is, even when we get it wrong, God doesn't disappear off the scene. As we learned in the previous lesson, sometimes God uses even the wrong decisions for good. He never leaves us, nor forsakes us. And yes, sometimes He makes the wrong decisions. But that's not the end of God. The promise is renewed, a great nation, even in a foreign land. Like I said to you, what awesome, sometimes strange to me, but what a magnificent God, that even amidst all of that, God, in the midst of slavery, of persecution, under the hands of the Pharaoh, of the people who were in charge of them, God forms a nation. God will do what He will. When He set His mind, Isaiah writer says, when He has stretched His hand, no one can turn it back. If He's decided, it is. The remainder of chapter 46 describes the reunion of Joseph and Jacob. In chapter 47, Pharaoh is introduced to 5 of Joseph's brothers, and they use their occupation, which is shepherds, because the Egyptians did not like the shepherds very much. And we'll also see that in the story of Joseph with his brothers. They're sitting separately when they're dying. Even though it's a lavish banquet, they still have to sit separately. And it results in them receiving the best of the land in Egypt for pastures. We also see right at the beginning, same with the Bedouins, from Sinai, the son of Rachel, which was allowed in temporarily sometimes in the ground. When their pastures were not so good, they were allowed to come pasture their own flocks. Note also the covenant blessing, which included the nations who are blessed during the famine, as I said earlier. The covenant will play itself out. God's word will play itself out. There's no stopping it. Jacob dies at the age of 147, and his request to be buried with his fathers was honored by the sons. The ceremony in chapter 48, the ceremony of making an oath and perpetuating the covenant to the descendants, included placing the hands in the hollow of the thigh. Perhaps, the writer says, it implies a passing on of covenant consciousness and responsibility. Jacob adopts Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. You will notice in the tribes, in the 12 tribes, there's no Joseph tribe. There's a Manasseh tribe and there's an Ephraim tribe. Again, here that rule is applied, but in the case of Isaac, of Esau and Jacob, Jacob steals it. Here, Jacob decides how he wants to apply the blessing. And he chooses the younger son over the older, over the firstborn. And Joseph tries to stop him. He says to him, this is the way it's going to be. This is how God has intended to do it. So I'm going to carry out that. Joseph receives also a double portion of his father's inheritance. Chapter 49 is a piece of Hebrew poetry, and much of it, according to the writer, is prophetic. And here we have Jacob blessing his sons, and the writer tells us that he knew them very well. We also see the blessing as he relates the blessings to each of his sons. A part of their history comes to the fore, and their character. For example, Reuben, the firstborn, is severely reprimanded for his weakness of character. Remember, he is accused of incest. Simeon and Levi were rebuked for their deeds of violence in the case of Dinah, when they slaughtered the tribe of Shechem. Judah would be praised by his brothers because of his strength in battle, and his strong character was demonstrated by his mediating role in the treatment of Joseph and his willingness to serve as ransom for Benjamin. Genesis 44:11-12 have been identified with the Messianic age. Not only would the kingship not depart from Judah, but the king would come riding on an ass and tie his beast to a vine, and abundance of harvest was implied. The covenant continues. Never ends. Zebulun would dwell by the seashore. Issachar chided for living in ease and would become a slave for a foreign master. Dan is the smallest tribe, would be shrewd in attacks against the enemy. Gad would maintain his freedom against attacks from the Bedouin. Asher would receive the fertile strip from Mount Carmel and would be blessed by ample food. And they're also known for their dainties. Naphtali would enjoy prosperity. Joseph would be blessed above all others. The warlike character of Benjamin is noted. The chapter ends with the request of Jacob to be buried in the field of Machpelah. 50 records the mourning of the death of Jacob, embalming of his body and the burial in Canaan. Joseph requests to be reburied in Canaan, and he dies at the age of 110. I just want to take you back to the lessons in the previous chapter, but that first one accounts for all of the chapters. God is the provider. God is the co-ordinator of history. That's what I need you to remember. God will fulfill what He says. When He makes a promise, that's it. That's why the covenant, the original covenant, is so important. When the animals are split in two, and Abram falls asleep, God makes the promise to himself. Why? Because He is truth. He is truth. He cannot lie. He's not a man.